Hello, and welcome to Synthesized Sunsets. Today, we're joined by Dylan O'Neill, a writer who recently published his short story, Snowlight, which was the first submission ever accepted by Synthesized Sunsets. While this is Dylan's first published story, he's been working on his writing for quite a while, and he's planning to release his first novel at some point in the near future, which is entitled Orange Sky, Dark Sun. Dylan, we're very excited to have you on the show. So I guess just to start out, before we get into talking about the story, I wanted to get a little bit of sense of how you got into writing and what your writing process is like. So, would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've written forever. I think it comes from when I was a kid. I was a big reader. I think that's kind of where it usually stems from. I remember like being in like second grade, we had these like 20-minute long reading periods, and I had Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. And after this little like reading period, I'd sneak it under my desk and I'd kind of like look down and read like one sentence at a time. And then I remember one day I was sitting at home, bored, I guess, probably around the same time, maybe 7 years old, and I wrote the entire final chapter of the Chamber of Secrets, like word for word, in like a journal. And then I think I like tweaked a few sentences to try to, I don't know, spice it up. And I showed it to my mom, and she's like, "Oh, this is cool. Do you think maybe you should write your own thing instead of like literally copying an existing book word for word?" So, so yeah, I remember that. I also remember, I don't remember if it was second or third grade, but there was like one day a semester where we literally just wrote, where our teacher said, "Start now, write," and put together a little outline. She would like check our outlines, and then she'd give us like 4 hours to write. And I remember everybody kind of groaning about it. And I remember thinking, like, this is the coolest thing I've ever done. So yeah, it's kind of been like that since then. Like through middle school, we would have like writing assignments, and even in like history class, we'd have like a writing assignment. And I remember in sixth grade, it was to write a historical event from somebody that participated in the event's perspective. And I wrote a like a letter of somebody that was sitting there at Jonestown when like everybody drank the Kool-Aid. And I think it was supposed to be 2 pages, and I ended up writing like 24 pages. And my teacher's like, "Dude, what are you doing? Like, how long did this take you?" I was like, "I wrote it all last night." So yeah, it's kind of just always been a thing. I think it went away a little bit, maybe around like 16, 17, 18. I guess I was just busy with high school and, sports and all that stuff. And then I didn't write for a few years in college, but I took a class my senior year called Vikings Legends and Lore. Keep in mind, I'm an electrical engineering major, and kind of proves that college is a scam. Um, but I will say, I used the class because we had to do like public speaking, and I had to, whatever. I had to do a lot of public speaking for the class, which is probably the biggest skill that I learned in college. But anyway, my professor was like one of the world's leading experts on Vikings. I want to say he lived in Norway for like 10 years studying this stuff. And he kind of taught this class, and there was maybe 15 or 20 people in it. And like, I want to say 4 or 5 people showed up. And it was the only version of this class. And like nobody cared. People were on their phones. And it just made me feel so bad because I'm like, this is the most interesting thing I've ever heard. And there's 5 people sitting in this class from this guy who's a literal, like, he helped write the book Children of Ashen Elm, which, if you know anything about the Vikings, that's like the book about it. And I just remember sitting after class every day and talking to him for like 30 minutes, an hour, or whatever, and just trying to pick his mind. And that kind of was the genesis of the book that I'm currently working on now. And that was 2 years ago. So that kind of kick-started the writing thing again a couple of years ago when I hadn't really picked it up in about 7 years.
I feel like it's kind of reassuring to hear that you had I don't know, maybe a somewhat similar trajectory to me. One thing I talk about a lot is how in elementary school, I feel like there was a much, much more literate culture. Like there were just these really big blocks of time set aside for reading and writing that I kind of just expected to continue into like, I guess, college, but this
Mhm.
was not really the case. I had by far the most time designated to write in like this 1 year of elementary school compared to like any other years of school, and it's not even close. And I definitely, yeah, like there was like for us, there was like one day a semester where it was just like
Mhm.
you read the whole day, actually. It wasn't like the whole day, but it was like these like specific half days where like the scheduling got all messed up, so it was kind of a wash. And they were like, you know what? Just like bring some books, just read all day. One of those days, probably the best day of my entire life. I read like The Hunger Games and a couple, maybe not super fantastic YA novels, but it was just such a good day. The thing about writing, though, is that I actually bounced off writing pretty hard in that I guess, like my taste in literature just kind of like accelerated so quickly that I guess I feel like I had like an okay ability to evaluate a text before I could even write like super coherent paragraphs.
Mhm.
And so like I would just start writing and I was just like, wow, this is so bad. This is so bad. Because I'm not even at the stage of like people who are embarrassed to write now, right? Like I'm still learning how to like string together paragraphs. And so like as a result, I would feel like so much shame about like reading my own writing that I would just like not writing anything. So I do have a lot of memories of me just like sitting there and being like, maybe I could write this. I'm like, no, it's so cringe. I'm just like, maybe I can write this. And sometimes after like a couple hours, I thought of something that like I thought was like not cringe, just like regular, like not that good. I'm just like, this is like, passable, I suppose.
Wait.
And I think like as a result, there were just like a lot of like I feel like I had a couple teachers that thought it was maybe just like kind of stupid because I would just be like, just like sit there and like not do anything. But yeah, so maybe not like a super great early experience with writing. But at the same time, I do think I'm kind of on the same page on I think at a certain point of reading stuff, you will feel compelled to write. Like I think it's pretty hard to spend a really great amount of your time, on the page and not think like, well, like spice it up a bit. I feel like sometimes you're like, well,
Mhm.
I feel like I could do a little bit better than that. I think that's kind of the moment where you're like, okay, maybe I should like try out this writing
Yeah,
thing.
for sure. Yeah, and I think that like I think that create like doing creative things as a kid also lends to wanting to write, if that makes sense. Like I think I started writing. We used to always go over to my grandparents' house. And when we went over there, it was like, here's some pencils and some blank sheets of paper, whatever, draw something cool and bring it to us. And, just simple stuff like that, I think kind of stimulates that part of the brain. So like then I would get home and I'd be reading and I'm like, you know what? I can draw a cool picture. I can write a story. You know what I'm saying? Like even for kids, I think just stimulating any type of creativity enhances all other types of creativity and kind of makes you use that part of your brain.
So I guess one thing I want to ask you about is in terms of your writing process. This might be like an oversimplification, but I feel like writers will often have a starting thing that the rest of their story will flow down from. So, for example,
Mm.
like Ursula K. Le Guin talks about how when she wrote The Dispossessed, at the beginning there was only this character called Chevek, and over time, like this just became a very, very real character in her mind, and like just kind of all of the novel kind of flowed out of like this one guy and trying to understand his context and his story. Whereas I feel like a lot of other sci-fi, it'll flow down from like some core idea, right? Like in like Foundation by Isaac Asimov, there's this idea of like psychohistory and like using scientific methods to predict like the course of civilizations in like the galaxy. And I think for myself, I haven't really figured out like what is the most natural way to like what's kind of like the natural thing to start with. And I think it also is very person dependent. What would you say is like the thing that you start with a story? Or do you think it's like highly variable?
Well, this short story actually started. I had a dream of the end scene, and I started from there. Which is, funnily enough, that's exactly how I started writing my novel too. Was I had a dream of how the novel's gonna end, but I had a dream that I was in my parents' kitchen, and it was like either pre-dawn or like pre-dusk. It was kind of just dark and gray outside, and I had to protect this kind of young woman who ended up becoming Willa. from a much older man who was her husband, and all I had was like a smashed and flattened bush light box, which didn't make it into the story, to use as a shield. Very weird. And all I remember is I'm like trying to defend her and like shout for help, and obviously it's a dream, so I can't shout. And her husband has like an orange glowing fire poker, and he's trying to stab her with it, and I'm trying to like kind of block her. Anyway, all I remember is kind of turning and looking, and I see like this lady's shadow like flying over the treetops, right? So that's I'm like, okay, that's super cool. So I'm gonna jot that down in my notes app. Um, and that was years ago. And a couple months ago, I finished part two of my novel, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna take 2 weeks off from writing. And I think after like 4 or 5 days, I was just in a horrible mood. I was like, I can never do this again. And I had just been editing for like a month at that point, and I kind of hate editing. So I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna write a short story and see how it goes because I haven't tried to write a short story really ever. So I started. What I really started with is okay. I know that there needs to be a male protagonist because I want to follow my dream because whatever. And obviously, I didn't like plan on publishing it or anything. I just wanted to write a short story based on this dream. I knew there needs to be a male protagonist, and I know that he needs to end up trying to help this girl out at the end. And the themes kind of already obviously laid themselves out: dependency, manipulation, and I think I included Charlotte at first just because she had the line, "I know the babysitter can fly," and I was like, "That's cool foreshadowing." And then obviously it literally just grew from there. I had no idea where it was going. I wrote the first few pages where they're kind of sitting there bored on a Friday night, their mom's not home, and they travel out to this like Canadian backcountry, way in the gloomy forest or whatever. And they get there, and I didn't know where to go from. I'm like, they can't just walk in and see this. That's not much of a story. So of course, then I decided to write some like dreamy, surreal rooms that they have to go through and all this kind of fun stuff. And looking back, I don't know if you guys have seen WandaVision. It's kind of like a similar vibe. Yeah, like it's almost like a created reality to escape the trauma that she's going through instead of just escaping. You know what I mean? Um, so yeah, that's kind of a long-winded way of answering a question. But I had this dream, and I was like, oh, that's a cool scene. And then I just kind of went backwards and said, okay, I need this guy to be the main character. They need to go out, and I need this little girl because children have an interesting perspective because they haven't seen very much of the world. So they kind of just take magic as matter of fact because they haven't seen enough to doubt it. You know what I mean? Like when you're 6 years old, a lot of things probably seem magic, if that makes sense. So that was a good kind of plot device, I guess, is Charlotte being in the story. And then it just went from there. Like I'm not a plotter at all. Even my novel, like I knew what the prologue was going to be, and I knew what the last chapter was going to be, and then I just started throwing stuff on paper.
Um, yeah, so I just want to introduce this story a bit for listeners who might not have read the story. So I think Rich Horton's description of the story was pretty good and pretty short and sweet. So I'm just going to read it here. So he said, the story is about Miles, who is caring for his much younger sister, Charlotte. His babysitter is a woman named Willa who lives in an odd house. One day, Charlotte inveigles Miles to come to Willa's house, and Miles finds an unexpectedly young woman, a house that is perhaps bigger on the inside than the outside, and a sinister boyfriend. The story effectively evokes beauty and weirdness and danger. Now, one thing I do want to address about this story is I feel like when we laid our guidelines for the submissions, we were kind of just like, we maybe want it to be like solar themed, and we maybe want it to be like speculation in like this way or whatever. And I would not say that this story was like the most in line with these guidelines. So I just want to I want to explain ourselves a bit. I feel like there are definitely some good, some pretty clear like through lines between this story and Synthesized Sunsets, though. I feel like the biggest thing, which you probably didn't really have much of a way of knowing, but especially in the beginning of Synthesized Sunsets, we had a lot of essays about childhood and
Mm-hmm.
particularly like kind of these very like sensory childhood experiences in relation to speculative fiction. And so, at least myself, and probably also Gordon, pretty sympathetic to stories that have that kind of atmosphere. And I would also say that this story, you said in your submission that it can kind of be on theme if you squint. And I think that like when I was talking about the sun as like a theme, I was kind of trying to focus less on like the actual specific object of the sun and more as like the sun as like, something that you're kind of like trying to reach or like like a beacon of some sort. And I feel like if you squint, like yeah, the story is kind of in line with it in that sense. So I think that even though we probably will pick more like on theme stories the rest of the season, I definitely think there are some parallels between like the theme and our selection. I don't know if you had anything to say about it, Gordon.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that like immediately stood out to me about this story is, I mean, sort of what Kevin I think it was interesting that Charlotte wasn't exactly like in your initial like concept of the story, because I think she was like really well written and sort of like what most jumped out to me immediately about this story. Yeah, like I was just looking for it, see if I can find this. Okay, my original message to Kevin right after reading this story was just like, I like the most recently submitted story quite a bit. Plot and ideas were pretty solid, but mainly I thought the prose was quite good. Like there were a few dialogue passages that felt very smooth. And then as an example, we have right, you'll hear more. No matter what you hear, you have to close your eyes, okay? Can you be brave for me and Miles? It isn't brave to close my eyes, Charlotte said. That's easy. Different things are brave in different situations, Willa said. It isn't normally brave to hug your mom, right? No. Well, what if she's had a tough day and she shouts at you and she's throwing things or slamming the kitchen cabinets? Is it brave to hug her then? I guess that's brave. Are you brave? Charlotte sniffed and nodded. Then you can keep your eyes shut no matter what you hear. Yes. Like I thought that passage was really good, and there were a few like dialogue segments that just felt very natural, and specifically for Charlotte as a character. I don't know. I feel like a lot of times I read kids in fiction and I kind of just like don't believe in their existence. Like I'm like,
Yeah.
this person has like forgotten what it's like to be a kid, and I was like, you did not forget what it's like to be a kid, sort of. So yeah, I mean that was kind of what most jumped out to me about the story.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I this is kind of my first experience writing from the perspective of a kid, and it's nice because they just say what they think. Like this is the easiest thing ever. Like she's scared, she's gonna say, "I'm scared." You know what I mean?
Yeah, similarly, I find that a lot of this is more a thing in like conversation, but I feel like a lot of times people will describe like kids or like being a kid, and it just feels like there's a big disconnect between how I remember being a kid and observing kids and what people say. And whenever I see kid dialogue that feels plausible, I'm kind of like it like really stands out to me. I remember one book that I read that I really liked in school. Probably one of my favorite books that I've read in school was Room by Emma Donoghue, which was adapted into like an Oscar-winning
Mhm.
film. But I actually think
Yeah.
the book was better. And part of the reason I think the book was better is because the book has this very realistic kid narration. Like it's told entirely from the first person perspective of the kid. And it's told in such a way that you can't really tell what the atmosphere of the book is from the start because the kid is just applying all this kid gloss over it. And he's just like,
Mhm.
I colored today. And then we like went to the TV world. And you can't really tell that it's this pretty like fucked up situation. Whereas when you start
Right.
watching the movie, it's like, they're in some like sketchy basement. There's not really any sort of ambiguity you can create. Um,
Right.
but when I read the like in the author's note, they basically said that like how they ended up making the dialogue is they just like took a bunch of notes about how I forget it was like their son or like their niece or something like took a bunch of notes on like how they speak and then basically like applied that to the text. I thought that was cool. And another work that I really like that is very different that uses realistic kid dialogue is World of Tomorrow, which is a short film. And this film is very interesting because they go to the next step and they actually use raw recorded audio from their niece and then like just inject this into the film. So like they basically just got all of these like sound snippets of like stuff that their niece had said, and then tried to build a story around these like dialogue elements. I think that's really cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, that
like
is
a
cool.
4-year-old or something too, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah, yeah. They're like not
that
coherent at
young.
all.
Yeah.
Um, but I was wondering, like, how did you, like, you seem like, do you think that writing kid dialogue, like, uh, comes pretty, you said it comes pretty naturally to you. Do you feel like a similar disconnect with what other people say about being a kid, or do you think people are just kind of like the people that you know are kind of on the same page as you?
Yeah, I don't know. I do think that I do think there's a disconnect probably. I think that people, talking about being a kid and people writing from the perspective of being a kid is very different. I think the best example I've seen in a book is the first like maybe 10 pages of Cujo by Stephen King. And I mean, it's from the perspective of a 6-year-old and it scared the shit out of me, or a 4-year-old even. He, where the kid basically he just wakes up and he sees something in his closet, whatever, screams, and his parents come in. And it's a pretty simple scene, but written through the kind of thick filter of the kid's mindset, it just blew me away. I think so. There's one sentence, and it's so I guess the kid gets up and takes a piss or whatever, and then he comes back, and his parents come in and say, you need to go to the bathroom. Go to the bathroom." And the kid Tad says, "He didn't argue because parents don't believe you," or something like that. And it's just something along those lines where like, how do you even get that closely into the mind of your character that this 10 pages is perfectly summarizes how it was to be 5 years old. You know what I mean? And it's almost like it made me recall what it was like being young in a way that I'd completely forgotten, if that makes sense. And that I thought that was very powerful.
I think one thing that your story does pretty well in terms of authentically reflecting being a kid is that kids have a really weird understanding of agency, I think, of their own agency. When I was a kid, there is some stuff that I definitely felt like I could do. Like, I could like climb a tree. I don't know. There's probably some stuff that like I don't even really feel the same, like that I could do the same amount now. But there are some stuff that was like totally within my capabilities, but I was like so far away from thinking I could do it that it wasn't even a possibility. Like for example, and this is an essay in I wrote an essay in Synthesized Sunsets about this, but when you're like at recess or something, there's kind of like this area there's often this area that you're just like really not allowed to go outside of under like any circumstances. And it's not like anyone can actually stop you, but I feel like it kind of just becomes like an almost like physical barrier because of how strong the social conditioning is to
Mhm.
not do this. Like I never once considered seriously that like, oh, I could just like go home right now. Like I could just like walk out. I could just walk past the fence and go home. Like I totally could have. I might not have even gotten caught, but like this didn't even cross my mind as a possibility. And so I think there's a lot of things that like kids they can like totally do. And if you ask them, they might be like, "Oh, like I guess I could do this," but it would just like never occur to them organically. And I think this is kind of analogous to like spoilers, but what happens to Willa at the end of the story is like she can just she can just fly, right? Like she could have done it the whole time, but at the same time, like someone actually had to say it as like a thing you can do. And I think that as a kid, it can often be hard to bring some action in the abstract into the realm of like, okay, these are concrete actions that I could actually take.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Um, I think that also Charlotte saying, you know, Willa, you can fly is kind of like showing that Willa hadn't even considered like, oh, I can just leave. You know what I mean? Because Brian's manipulation and narcissism, whatever it is, it had kept her trapped in this almost like Stockholm syndrome cycle that she hadn't even thought a single time. Oh, I can just leave. I can literally fly. And the reason I think that I had Charlotte, even in the story, was just to say that line. at the beginning. You know what I mean? Because it's such an elementary idea. Like, you can just leave. Like, why didn't you just think of that? But it shows that, when you're a victim, it's never that simple, if that makes sense.
Mhm, mhm. I also think something that it does well is you mentioned this before, but I feel like the relationship that kids have with fiction and reality is like talked about in like very vague terms, but I feel like it's not as simple as like, oh, they just like don't know when stuff is fake. For
Mhm.
example, when I was a kid, I definitely knew that like fictional stuff was a lot less likely to happen. Like it's not very likely that someone can just do magic. But in fact, there are a lot of kids' books that are told in a way that's like somewhat consistent with the real world. Like there's a lot of books where it's like, oh, none of the adults know that magic exists, but actually, like, some of these kids can do magic. And this is like totally coherent with my reality. And so, like, in my mind, I'm like, well, this is like some piece of anecdotal evidence that, like, some people can do magic, and there's some evidence that people cannot do magic. And, like, I just sort of thought, like, doing magic is something that has maybe like a 2% probability as opposed to like totally ruled out. And I think like as a kid, one of the biggest things is you're just really unable to assess the quality of evidence sort of like all evidence is like the same. Like you see something in the you see something in a movie, you like read something in a book, someone tells you something, it's all just like flat bits of information. And like I feel like as like one of the thing like the only thing is like, oh, did it come from like an adult or like did it come from a kid, you know? And so like I think part of maturing is just learning that like not all sources of information are like created equal.
Valid.
Um
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of 6-year-olds struggle with the scientific method. I like very powerfully remember being like 7 years old, sitting on my couch after I watched Revenge of the Sith, trying as hard as I could to summon my Wii remote into my hand. Probably 30 minutes. I genuinely thought if I concentrated as hard as I possibly could, it would happen.
I feel like I've done
Because
similar stuff. Like
yeah,
it sounds very
100%.
relatable.
Maybe I still do. But I'm just wondering.
One thing that's like a really interesting experience when I was a bit older is like for a while I was getting kind of into like lucid dreaming. And one thing that's really interesting about dreaming is it reveals like the gap between what you kind of know is possible in a dream, which is like anything basically, versus like what you kind of feel like is something you can do. I remember there were a few times where I actually entered a lucid state in a dream and I would like try to fly, but it was really janky because like my logical mind was like interfering. It's like, no, like you can't actually do this. Like there were a couple times where I just like try to fly and then as soon as I think about the fact that I can't fly, I would just like stop flying. And also like I was really uncertain about like the aerodynamic component or like how this would actually work. Like there's like Superman style, right? And there's like flapping your arms. And like I remember the time that I was most successful at flying is I was just like standing like this and I was just like kind of like flapping my arms like this and just kind of like going up in the air. But it was like not fun at all. Like it felt like a lot of work. And I was just like, man, I guess I'm just cooked in this
It's like
way.
Flappy
Like
Bird.
yeah, I know. It was like Flappy Bird, except I was like pointed down. Like I was looking down at the floor and then kind of just like
Yeah.
going like that. Like the
You
like
were aware this
jellyfish
was
stroke and
happening?
the what? Yeah. I was aware.
That's awesome. Lucid dreaming, huh? Yeah, I've never really like tried to get into lucid dreaming. I remember when I was a kid, one of my buddies told me if I drank like 3 cups of apple juice, I would lucid dream, and then I think I just pissed myself. But
But
I do remember I had one lucid dream, and it was very strange. It was maybe a week after my great grandma died. Uh, we called her Nana. It's my my dad's mom's mom. She I woke up and it was like maybe 6 in the morning, so there was a little bit of light. And I sat up and I literally I think I like muttered out loud, "I'm dreaming." And I look over and she's sitting at my desk, kind of just looking at me, like rocking a little bit. And I like it sounds creepy, right? But I remember not feeling scared at all. I kind of remember just being like, "How's it going?" And she's like, "Oh, I'm doing good." Like I weirdly vaguely remember her telling me about how she painted her nails, but that's really the only lucid. But I remember like telling her like I'm dreaming right now, and she was like, "Yeah, I know." I thought that was strange little story.
Uh, yeah, like
Yeah, I've had like a couple. I have one I remember where I tried to fly, but like my method of flying in this lucid dream was just like kind of like reversing gravity, but then I like couldn't come back and it just kind of sucked. And eventually I woke up, like I just like watched the world, like I was just like watched the world slowly receding as I like started to panic. I was like, "Fuck, I'm just falling upwards forever," and then I just woke up.
I think lucid dreaming is quite possible, but I think it is a little bit overrated. Because I feel like you are going to run into these pretty hard limits in terms of what you think you can do, unless you like really get on the grind. And I remember something that I struggled with is like the resolution of my reality was just really low. Like if I actually really tried to concentrate on like a specific sensation or experience, it would just feel very artificial. Like I remember there's this one time where I tried to like eat an orange or something, and like it like was an orange, but it just like something wasn't quite about it. It's like halfway between like remembering eating an orange and like actually eating an orange, and just like really not the experience that I was going for. And I feel like I would just kind of end in this. Sometimes even my vision would just be like 240p or something. Like I could just like not really see things in the way that I wanted to, and things would kind of just like start to like vaporize as I would look at them. I didn't really enjoy the experience all that much. But I did get pretty deep into it in terms of like the subculture. Like I was reading stuff that was probably meant for people much older than me to be reading. Like there was this one thing where they were talking about various supplements you can take to like increase your like dreaming ability. One of them is like there's some low level hacks. Like apparently if you eat like a bunch of cheese or like a bunch of turkey right before bed, it has like tryptophan, which has like interesting effects on your dreams. Another one is there's this hallucinogen called like Kalia Z, which is legal in like 49 states or something. And if you take this supplement, apparently it like is a hallucinogen that only activates when you're dreaming, and so it's supposed to like I guess fix this problem. Like your dreams just become very sharp and vivid, but apparently it can also lead to pretty bad nightmares. So there's that as well.
That's
Um,
fascinating. Yeah.
but I think that that people did talk about that though. Like there were actually people who would get into lucid dreaming specifically for the purpose of talking to loved ones.
Mhm.
And there were some interesting anecdotes about that. I remember reading. I wonder if all this stuff still exists, like all the forums I used to go on when I was like in middle school and stuff.
Dude, this sounds like a rabbit hole I could disappear down for like a week. I think I'm gonna
Yeah.
start researching as soon as we're done with this podcast. It's awesome.
But yeah, going back to the story a little bit, I was wondering how you create a like a dreamlike register. Like, is it more of like a headspace you try to get in as you're doing your writing, or is it like some kind of intentional craft thing that you try to do, or something else?
I think if you just write it as matter of factly as possible, I to me it almost sounds like if I just write it as fact, like I walk into the drunk tank pink room and then this is what it is. Like don't try to explain that it's dreamy at all. Just show it and let the reader kind of take it as it is. You know what I mean? Like show the elevator. Um and I've always liked kind of I guess trippy sequences and like shows. What's that David Lynch show?
Twin Peaks.
Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks. I watched Twin Peaks in like high school, and there's really famous dream sequences where everything just kind of seems a little off. And I think that for me, at least, what I thought was effective in the story was stating it matter of factly, but then showing maybe one or two small details that kind of trigger something in the reader's mind. That's like, oh, that's weird. Like showing the DVD's change in the DVD case, I guess, or something simple like that. If that makes sense. My all of my favorite moments in books and like TV shows are like a snap to a kind of a similar reality, like basically dreamy reality.
Mhm.
My single favorite piece of art ever is the episode International Assassin in The Leftovers. I don't know if you guys have seen The Leftovers, but basically the main character, this is like huge spoilers for the whole show. Basically, the main character, the episode before, he takes poison so that he can go to the afterlife and get rid of these voices that he's hearing and seeing, basically. And the guy who was supposed to bring him back to life shoots himself in the head, and the episode ends. So it's like the main character just died. So you're like, where's this gonna go? So anyway, the next episode, he wakes up and he's in a hotel, and he's like, what the hell's going on? And literally the next hour is just most insane shit you can possibly imagine. of him like navigating this. And up to this point, the entire show has been completely like dead straight. There's been no supernatural, no nothing, but it's just an hour of chaos, and it's this weird, dreamy reality. But there's also like real world consequences. And I just remember like as soon as I watched that episode of TV, something flipped in my mind, and I'm like, oh, this is what I'm into. And like Fargo, I don't know if you guys have watched the show Fargo, but in season 2, there's this big kind of shootout, and it's basically just a straight up crime TV show. And then a literal UFO just drops in the middle of this shootout. And one of the main characters, Jesse Plemons, says, "Honey, that's a UFO." And his wife's like, "Okay, that's cool. We got other shit to worry about." And they never talk about it again. And I'm like, that's awesome. And it's the same way. It's the same way with like The Dark Tower, which is my favorite series ever. The Shining, the whole dream sequence where the main character like starts to lose his mind. He's like talking to the ghosts in the hotel. Like these are all of my favorite moments from fiction. So this is what I kind of just naturally gravitate towards writing.
One thing I want to talk about is some of your favorite authors. So some authors that you mentioned liking are George Saunders, Kurt Vonnegut, Stephen King, George R. R. Martin. I think one thing that's interesting about these authors is that I feel like in the public imagination, they're like the same distance away from sci-fi. And what I mean by that is if you ask someone about like, oh, like George Saunders or like Kurt Vonnegut, like, are they sci-fi? It's like, well, kinda. And like there is some kind of tenuous connection, but like I think in people's minds there's like a little bit of removal from like the sci-fi core, which is fair. However, I would say that all of these authors have very unique, like or distinct relationship with the sci-fi community, like from each other. So George R. R. Martin, for example, is like a really big fan of science fiction. Actually, wrote a good amount of science fiction itself, which is now overshadowed by A Song of Ice and Fire, obviously. And so I think he's kind of like on one end of the spectrum, whereas like Kurt Vonnegut was often considered to be a science fiction writer by the literary critics at the time, and he just like hated this. He was just like, I don't want to be considered science fiction. I just want to be considered a novelist. And then I feel like George Saunders and Stephen King are like somewhere in between. I mean, Stephen King did like sci-fi, and he kind of got his start there, but at a certain point, he just kind of became like bigger than like the entire genre. I feel like. I mean, that guy just sells so many books. But I was wondering, like, what do you imagine that your relationship with science fiction is going to be? Like, I think obviously it's a bit too early to say, but like, do you think you would feel comfortable being like a sci-fi writer, or do you think you would resist such categorization?
I don't think I'd resist anything. I think people can categorize me any way they want. I won't get mad, like Kurt Vonnegut. But then again, Kurt Vonnegut's a way better writer than me, so he probably has more grounds to get mad on. No, I honestly don't like writing with more technology than we have right now. And I think it's just because, like, if you write, I guess the technology level of the book I'm writing is kind of like medieval ish, like Dark Ages ish. And I think it just makes it cooler, in my opinion. Obviously, my favorite movie ever growing up was Revenge of the Sith. So I loved that. I was into it. And when you're talking about my favorite authors, it sounds like I'm just a huge sci-fi guy who's afraid to admit it. um, I honestly don't really see myself getting super sci-fi, but who knows? I go through phases. Like every week, I have something different that I want to write. You know what I mean? But as far as like writing a fantasy, I think I would try to keep technology out of it, just because it almost feels more stripped down to the point where it's like it's just these characters sitting around a fire. You know what I'm saying? Communication's hard, and you can see that in A Song of Ice and Fire. It makes it interesting that, and George R. R. Martin's maybe the best author I've ever read at this. At everybody thinks something different is happening. Like Tyrion Lannister might say, "Oh, this just happened." Somebody else might think a completely different thing happened. Like everything's based on rumor, and nobody knows because there's a network of communication. So I honestly like that. I like stripping down stories as much as I possibly can. I think the novel I write after this one, unless it sells, then I'll write novel 2 and 3 and so on. Um, which I hope it does. But I actually started a book for maybe 3 weeks, wrote about 30 pages a couple years ago, and it's a contemporary book, but I just knocked it back to like 2011 because I'm like, I don't want to deal with iPhones. I just personally don't want to write with iPhones. I just feel like it strips down the story and leaves more room for the characters to breathe, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I remember. I think Lillian, friend of the pod, wrote a bit about that, where it's like does not want to see like iPhones like in her like fiction. And like yeah, there is like this awkward song and dance people do, especially in movies, where I feel like a lot of the time like smartphone use is just like unrealistically low because they just like it's just hard to portray in like a beautiful way. It's like it's very I feel like it's very rare that you're watching this very like cinematic movie and just like you go into a scene and everyone's like on their phone, even that's probably what would happen.
A group of friends just like all sitting on couches and shit, and they're all just like looking at something on their phone. Yeah, it was kind of just like
one movie that I actually quite like a lot, probably my favorite movie to be honest, is Your Name, and this is like an animated film. It's like very successful film in Japan. And I guess my favorite thing about it was really able to romanticize the like modern technological lifestyle in like a really visual way. Like, do you know how, I don't know if you've ever seen like a Studio Ghibli Miyazaki film, but you know how, have you, Dylan?
Yeah, The Girl on the Train,
Yeah, Spirited Away.
one of my favorite
Yeah,
movies.
yeah. You know how like in a Studio Ghibli film, whenever they pull out some food, it just looks like the best thing that you could
Oh, yeah.
ever eat.
Yep.
I feel like Your Name can do this effect with just like mundane objects of modernity. Like they'll just like pull out a phone or like you'll see a vending machine and you're just like, wow, this is like the greatest like mundane object I've ever seen. Or like you'll just look at like that is an absolutely beautiful traffic light. Like holy shit. And this is just something I've never seen in any other movie. So like, but I think this is a really hard effect to achieve. Like I don't think you would be able to do this in like live action.
Yeah. No, I think Black Mirror does a good job. But yeah, I agree. I think it's almost like seeing somebody wearing a mask in like a TV show. I'm like, okay, it just took me out of it. Like all I'm thinking about is why they're wearing a mask in a TV show. Like I know it's real and it happened and realism is important, but it's at a certain point, you're right, fiction.
Oh, one thing I want to talk about is you mentioned Kurt Vonnegut's one of Kurt Vonnegut's lectures slash courses, and he gave this. He's like given this lecture a few times called "The Shape of Stories," which is basically this reimagining of this thesis he submitted that got rejected. And his thesis was basically trying to like, I believe the gist of it is like he's saying that you can kind of like plot stories on like a axis where like the x-axis is like time and the y-axis is like the protagonist's fortunes as the story continues. And like just by seeing like this graph of like a story, this can tell you a lot about like what kind of story this is, and like maybe you can do further science to this and like apply this like scientific mindset. And he was saying how it was just sort of, people resistant to this for various reasons. But I think that the idea of applying scientific thinking to literature is really interesting, and it's something I have a lot of questions about. One of my, I think probably, I haven't read it much recently, but like for a time, my favorite author on Substack was this guy named Michael Dean. And what he basically did is he would apply this highly analytical framework to understanding essays called like, it was called like essay architecture, a pattern language or something. And he basically created this like geometry where he's like, well, every essay has these like three main, I don't know, components, which can be broken down into like 9 patterns for a total of like 27 dimensions. And then like he would like take some essay and just like break it down into chunks and then like try to do this mapping to like his pattern language. And like just like reading this, it was like so fascinating because I've never really seen someone get like that down into the weeds about like language, like word math. Like he was just doing like an unbelievable amount of word math. And so I was just wondering, in general, what is your, first of all, like, what do you think is it that jumped out to you about this lecture? But also, like, to what extent do you think it's useful to apply like a more technical scientific mindset to writing versus like how much of this is just kind of like anti-artistic and like a waste of time?
I think what's useful, well, what caught my attention from the lecture is that Kurt Vonnegut is hilarious. It's like it literally could have been an hour-long stand-up routine. And I know people said the same thing about Mark Twain, and they write very similarly. Like both of those people write, and it's hilarious. And it's really hard to communicate. I guess it's really hard to make people laugh from writing prose. And they're both great at that. And they were both like they say Mark Twain was the original stand-up comedian. But I think that what Kurt Vonnegut was getting at is you can write whatever the hell you want as long as people like to read it. Because if you look at the graph by the end of it, it's covered in 40 different plots. You know what I mean? Um, I think what he was getting at is as long as what you're writing is entertaining and it has some sort of payoff, even if it's a unique payoff, even if it's not kind of standard, people will read it and it's a good story. Because I think one of the examples was like what's that Franz Kafka short story called where he turns into Metamorphosis. One of his examples was Metamorphosis, and he says he starts low and then he just immediately drops off, and that's it. That's the whole story. He woke up, he was a bug, and things pretty much only got worse from there. And then he goes on to show 10 other ways. And I think if you read Kurt Vonnegut's stories, there really isn't any kind of linear plot. You can't look at one of his stories and say, okay, this is a hero's journey, or this is a classic tragedy. Like if you read Slaughterhouse-Five, the whole thing is the main character just bouncing around in time with some aliens sprinkled in and a whole lot of PTSD from World War II. And there really isn't a huge conclusion. I read it years ago. I could be wrong, but there really isn't a huge conclusion. But it's so well written and it's so intriguing. The story is so intriguing, and his outlook on life is so biting. Like it's so just on the point. Where if you read it, I'll read one paragraph and my mind is just blown. And it doesn't even really have to do with the story. I think that he was just such a gifted prose writer that he didn't have to have some super compelling story. And it kind of came through in that lecture because he's saying like, as long as it's good enough, people will read your stories. And I've never read an author that has less plot but is easier to read. Like I read Cat's Cradle recently, and I literally couldn't put it down. And I think it might have something to do with the fact that I think the longest chapter in that book is 500 words. I'm not even exaggerating. Like there's not a single chapter that is more than 2 pages long. So, which is another interesting thing when we're talking about the shapes of stories. Like I'm reading The Stand right now, and there are chapters that are 60 pages long, and I read Cat's Cradle recently, and when chapters are really short and choppy, you kind of tell yourself, "Oh, just one more chapter. Oh, just one more chapter." And all of a sudden, I'm sitting there, and it's midnight, and I've read 200 pages, and I only kind of notice that when stories have short chapters. So, kind of taking that into account, like obviously my writing is constantly motivated by the stuff that I'm reading. I tried to write some shorter chapters, and I think it actually turned out pretty good. So that's one interesting thing. Another thing about kind of the shape of stories beyond what Kurt Vonnegut wrote, I just saw this thing on Substack where somebody who works for a literary magazine calls out, I can look at the shape of a short story and tell if it's good or not without seeing the words, just looking at the paragraph shapes, which is very interesting to me. And he showed an example. He didn't zoom in on the words to like completely roast somebody, but he showed an example where the first 2 pages was like pretty much all dialogue, like the first page and a half, and then pages 3 and 4 were these big blocks. And what that is writers are told hook somebody with something at the beginning, and usually that's dialogue. Like in my story that you guys published, it was dialogue. Hook somebody, but then what these writers that don't always have the best stories tend to do is they hook somebody in the first page or two, and then they have 2 pages of exposition where they just dump info on you. And it's like, instead of, trying to slowly work it into the story, which is obviously a better thing to do, but these huge info dumps are when you're writing a book, and especially like the book I'm writing, which is a kind of a big epic fantasy, that it's really hard to make yourself not info dump that. But yeah, I just thought that was very interesting that this guy said you can literally look at the shape of a story, and before you read a word, you can tell a lot of the times which stories are going to get booted.
Yeah, this is only tangentially related, but one person we had on the podcast, Naomi Kanakia, one thing that she writes about is how in today's media environment, like the extent to which you need to hook a reader with prose is like even greater than it was in the past because there's just so many other things that can capture their attention. And so one thing that she's very interested in is like innovating around like how can you make it so that a reader will just kind of like come across your story and then like kind of get through it before they really know what they're doing. And so one thing that she tries to do is like all of her stories are like kind of just like they're kind of just like things that happen, like not like immediately recognizable as like, oh, this is a short story. It's kind of a thing where it'll just like come up in your feed and will be like a sort of clickbaity title, and it'll just be like, huh, like I wonder what this is, and you'll start reading, and then like halfway through you're like, wait, I'm just like reading this like short story, like what the heck? And this is actually just like the desired effect. And her like main take is that she thinks the short story is just kind of on the way out because it's just not really able to like compete in that way. Like there's not really the same kind of demand for it. Like people will write for it, but it won't be like a pillar of American literature in the way that it was in the past. But she doesn't think that like that means that literature is going away. Like she thinks that like prose fiction has a lot of life left in it. Rather, she thinks that like the shape of these stories and how they reach like readers' eyeballs is going to change a lot. And I think it's interesting because I think we're still in the early stages of this. Like there are definitely ways that people have tried to play with writing on the internet, but by and large, still the things that we consume on the internet are just kind of like very clearly descendants of these like legacy forms. I don't think that's going to be the case for long. I think like eventually literature might start to become very, very weird, and it'll be interesting to see what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that um, the idea of obviously kind of letting somebody ease into a story has always been a good way, especially when you're writing for maybe young adult, which is why a lot of big fantasy books will start with a regular life. Like think Narnia, Harry Potter. You know, it's kind of just like these kids are just kind of living shitty lives, which like, you know, is reality for a lot of kids. And then you slowly kind of ease them into all of these fantastical elements, and but by then they're already hooked. And I think it's just a great way to like when I write, I have one goal when I write a book, and it's trying to think of a metaphor. Like when I'm a kid and I'm going to swim in a creek, whatever people do in Missouri. Um, I'm gonna go swim in a creek, and there's this thing where a lot of like creeks have these really steep drop offs. So you take one step, take two steps, and then all of a sudden you're just like plummet straight to the bottom. That's all I'm trying to do when I write a story. I'm trying to get somebody in, and then I'm just trying to have the story kind of wrap around them, and then it's like you're inside of this world when you're reading.
Uh, uh, Yeah, speaking of different kinds of writing, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and ask you if screenwriting has ever been something that has appealed to you, and like why or why not.
Yeah, my dream is to be sitting in a writer's room and write a TV show. Like, and I think the three main inspirations from this is like watching interviews from the Breaking Bad writers' room and thinking like that is the coolest job on the planet, or listening to the It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia podcast and listening to those guys talk about like just sitting around writing and then actually go like seeing it hit the big screen. I think that's the coolest thing ever. And two of my favorite story creators are screenwriters. That's Damon Lindelof, who did Lost and The Leftovers and the Watchmen miniseries, and Noah Hawley, who did the new Alien show that's like still coming out, and he did Fargo. And yeah, to answer your question, yes, I would love to get into screenwriting.
Mhm. What so because TV is so dominant now, like obviously like there's sort of like I feel like prose fiction doesn't really have as clear of a place in the media environment it once did. So I was wondering, like, what role do you think novels play in today's media environment beyond just being things that, like, people can strip mine for IP? Like,
Yeah. I think that this is just pure conjecture. I obviously like haven't looked at any numbers or anything, but I feel like there's been a little bit of a bounce back the past few
uh,
years where like people are kind of tired of. I mean, I've deleted TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, everything 3 years ago, and I literally haven't missed it for a single second. Um, I think we're seeing a little bit of bounce back where people do want more almost meditative art to take in because when you're seeing all these 4-second videos, 10-second videos, whatever, it kind of drains you. You know what I mean? And there's really nothing like for example, I just got Substack because of this short story. I just got Substack, and I'm like, this is already way better than any, um, at least as far as like reading. This is already way better than any other social media because it's like you click on long form articles and you read it. That's pretty cool. But I think people are bouncing back. At least like talking to my friend groups and people that I know, I think people want more engaging media process. And I think people want to kind of lower their stimulation threshold to a point where you can get lost in a book. Because I think there for a while, there was maybe, I sound like an old man, but I think there for a while, there was maybe 20% of people my age, like early 20s, and especially like teenagers, that could actually sit down and not get distracted while in the middle of a book. You know what I mean? But I hope that long form media is coming back. I think that it is. I think that even like romantasy, people say what they want to say about romantasy, but it's got a shit ton of people reading, and that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing I would say for romantasy is I think while reading, I've always kind of mainly viewed reading as like an entertainment vessel more than like I don't read to like learn some life lesson or yeah, get some like moral teaching about the universe. And I feel like a lot of people say these types of things about like the value of reading, but like I don't know. I feel like if it's like the main value of reading for you is not because you enjoy it and because it's just like fun, you're like probably not gonna read that much. Like you might do it, might have your like 30 minutes of allotted time where you do your little bit of reading before going to bed or something. But you're not gonna like just like spend hours doing it out of choice if this is the case. And I feel like romantasy as a genre is just like very much marketed as like entertainment, not some
Yeah.
sort of like this is supposed to you do this because it's like good for your soul or something. But at the same time, it's I feel like much less. If you're like lying on your bed and watch like 2 hours of TikTok videos when you were like planning to just like spend 4 minutes doing it, but like suddenly 2 hours has passed. Like you don't feel like the same sort of self-disgust if you just
No.
like read a book for those 2 hours instead. Even if the book is not like the highest quality literature or whatever, it still feels like more fulfilling, I guess.
Yeah, it's active engagement. I think is I saw something about this recently. When you watch TV or when you watch a movie, the screen tells your eyes where to go, if that makes sense. The screen shows you the picture. When you read a book, you are creating. You do about 40% of the work. You know what I mean? Like when you read a book, you're creating these little dreamscapes in your mind that the author is just kind of guiding you there. And I think that that active engagement with the art is what makes it way more fulfilling than blindly scrolling through, videos of Island beef. If that makes sense.
oh, and also, just I guess kind of in response, like, reading is up over the past couple of years. Um,
Awesome.
I get the sense it is mostly driven by women. That being said, I would not be surprised if male interest in reading is going up as well. I would also say that this seems to be the case anecdotally, but it's also hard for me to decouple it with like, oh, this is just a thing that people do when they get to like a certain life stage. Like I feel like taking a dip in how much you read during like high school and college is just like pretty common. So it's hard to say, but I agree. Like, I think even if there hasn't been an uptick yet, like there certainly will be an uptick in the future. So I think this is like most of the like, I guess, on topic stuff I want to talk about. So we can cut it here, or we can also like shoot the shit talking about like, you know, Star Wars, Game of Thrones stuff.
I
It's
do want
like
to talk about Game of Thrones a little bit.
okay.
I have to hear because Kevin.
We did it till midnight.
I have not read Game of Thrones.
Yeah, Kevin hasn't read
Have you watched it?
or watched Game of Thrones.
I haven't watched Game of Thrones.
Brother.
I have, and as a result, have not talked about it significantly on this podcast. But yeah, I guess I think one of my main takes about like A Song of Ice and Fire is that I think reading it just like made me enjoy fantasy as a genre, like as a whole, a lot more because
Yep.
I think it was like one of the first like major adult like fantasy books that I read and stuff, and as a result, like reading it, like people just die, right? And the stakes just like felt so high, and that just kind of like carried over to like the whole genre. So I feel like George R. R. Martin just like did a service to like fantasy as a genre because you can kind of I feel like you can write a book and have it sort of like have some similar vibe to Game of Thrones and feel like very gritty and realistic, and you don't even have to kill off any characters because it's like George R. R. Martin already did the job of like making you believe that they could get killed off for you.
That's actually a great point. Yeah. I think that Lord of the Rings obviously is the prototype, is the blueprint. And I think that everybody tried to write Lord of the Rings until like exactly 1996 when A Game of Thrones came out. I think that like Robert Jordan, everybody, that was really Lord of the Ringsy. And then I think George R. R. Martin single-handedly changed that with one book. And I think that now it's like, okay, now you're reading kind of a fantastical version of some shit that really went down. The history is gross and messy and unpredictable, and everybody has kind of hidden agendas. George R. R. Martin says one thing that I really like, and he always says it in his interviews, and it's nobody goes from being 100% good to 100% bad. Nobody goes from being 100% bad to 100% good. Nobody stays, 70% their entire lives. And a lot of times it fluctuates as quickly as I'm going to be a great guy on Monday. I'm going to do everything I need to do. I'm going to be nice to everybody. And then on Wednesday, I'm going to be a complete asshole. And I think that it's pretty realistic to how people actually are. And I think that injecting that personal realism into such a like thoroughly lived in-depth fantasy kind of changed a lot of people's perceptions of what fantasy could do. And that's, like the book that I'm writing is 100% kind of writing those coattails a little bit. Like it's very different, but the very realistic people who aren't just like slowly going from bad to good or slowly going from good to bad, but maybe it looks more like kind of steps or like a jagged way up and then it drops and then it goes back up. I think that injecting that into fantasy definitely changed the landscape.
And like, to be clear, like I love Lord of the Rings, but I feel like in some ways it's like not the best story to copy because like in some ways the narrative is kind of very simple. Like it's a pretty simple like good versus evil structure, and I feel like it only works so well because like Tolkien is just like so good at like making you care about these people and these cultures and stuff. And it just like relies on that to like even work as a story. And if you just kind of like have this sort of like basic good versus evil structure but without like the same like imagination and like depth of like Lord of the Rings, it just kind of I feel like it falls on its face a bit. It feels kind of flat. And yeah, you just don't want like the whole genre to be like copying one thing that worked, right? You want things that are different. And yeah, I feel like Game of Thrones is definitely super cool.
Well, I guess to close things out, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like what your plans are like as a writer. Like where do you see yourself going in the next few years of writing, or like what are the different pathways that you see for yourself?
I want to keep working on this novel. I want to finish this novel. And my only goal here is to write a book that I know that I could walk into a bookstore and pick up and read and have my mind blown and sit there and rant about it to my wife for 3 hours, because that's like the peak, the best like compliment I can give a book is when I finish a book and I can rant about it for 2 hours to my wife. That's my only goal with writing this book. And it's a big epic fantasy book. It's all goes on in this one continent shaped kind of like an inner tube. There are a few different threads. The main thread is Stone Madison, who is the oldest son of these like ultra wealthy ranch owners. And I kind of tried to make it a little more Americana. Like there are ranches and cattle farms and all this stuff. There's still castles and all the medieval fun stuff. But anyway, Stone Madison is the oldest. He's a very famous heir to basically the biggest fortune, the biggest empire in the continent. And he runs away. And this is all well before the book. There's no spoilers here. He runs away and he goes to a different country, which is very corrupt. And he ends up killing, like I said, this is all before the book. He ends up killing some royal officers. So he goes to prison. In the first chapter, right away, he escapes prison, and basically all he has to do, he has to cross the entire western curve of the inner tube, basically, that is this continent. He has to cross the entire western half of this continent, try to find his wife, who is also on the run. She's a fugitive, she's in hiding. And I kind of just wanted to see how far I could push this character, like what he would do to get back to his wife, who he's been with for 10 years, basically abandoned this huge life of affluence just so he could go live with her in a hut in the middle of a rainforest. And that's thread number one. So it's just Stone's quest to find his wife, and there's all kinds of shit going on there. There's also a whole other thread that is kind of set in the north, and there is the royal family of this country is invited to a huge festival in the continental capital. So they're all headed that way. And there's kind of some weird stuff going on around this festival. And everything in this book is building towards kind of two big climaxes, right? The first is Stone finding his wife, and the second is this festival that's going on. And that's one of the climaxes is Orange Sky, and the other one's Dark Sun, and that's where that comes into play. And there's of course other subplots. There's a girl named Brynhild who's kind of a hero, and her little coastal village is constantly under attack by these raiders, and she kind of starts to unravel a conspiracy that they aren't just after silver. Maybe they're part of a bigger plot. And there is one other subplot who's my favorite character. Her name's Kelga, and she is the princess of this northern country. And nobody likes her. She's a drunk. She is just kind of like she's the youngest princess. Nobody really cares about her. And she kind of gets a wild hair and decides that she wants to go off on this ambitious quest. And she quickly finds herself chained to a monster and sent into exile with nobody to go save her.
Right.
But yeah, that's what I'm writing right now. And then I already have like book 2 and 3 mapped out in my mind. And I think that it'll be 4 books is the plan, depending on how the first book goes. But I think no matter what, I have to write these books. But yeah, I don't think I definitely won't stick to fantasy forever. I've got a couple other books I'm wanting to write that are kind of all almost like horror or mystery, or I just long term, what I want to do is I want to have a huge variety of works. I want to have some horror books, some fantasy, maybe some sci-fi. I just want to have a big body of work. And when I finish this book, I will make sure to send it to you guys. I'll let you guys know.
All right. Yeah. Nice. Yeah. I mean, yeah, we'll be sure. I mean, it's actually, you describing the book, it's probably more in our wheelhouse than I was expecting.
Or
Like
what?
more in our wheelhouse than I was expecting. Like it definitely seems like something we would read.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
um but yeah, I think this is a pretty good time to wrap things up. And as a final thing, is there anything that you would like to plug? And is there a short story of any kind that you would like to recommend?
I think I just did the plugging. I think I just talked about
Yeah,
my
yeah, I
book.
guess that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm talking about a book that isn't finished yet. The goal is to finish it this year and edit the shit out of it. Um, which I hate editing, but that's when I mean, like, I honestly learned with this story that editing is when a story becomes good because the first draft of this book was all over the or this short story that you guys published was all over the place. But yeah, the plan is to finish this book and it's called Orange Sky, Dark Sun by me, Dylan O'Neill, and hopefully, hopefully it'll be out sometime next year. And as far as short stories, my favorite short story ever is The Man in the Black Suit by Stephen King. It's a great one. There's one by Ray Bradbury that I love, and I can't think of the name of it. It's his most famous short story. I think it's called The Veldt, like
Oh, the
VE.
belt. Yeah.
That's a good one. What else?
Uh,
Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut. Oh, and the last one is called Two Talented Bastids. It's by Stephen King. It's the first one and his newest. It was so good. And anybody who says Stephen King isn't literary, check that short story out. It's good. It's very good, and it is very literary. But yeah, that's all I got.
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show, and we will see you all next week, which will be many weeks from now.
Welcome back. So, any thoughts on the episode, Kevin?
Yeah, so like the past couple episodes, this episode was recorded quite a long time ago. But it was a good time. I really enjoyed reading the story, Snowlight, and I also really enjoyed talking about it. I think one thing that was interesting was just the um, like I've been reading more about these sci-fi authors where they kind of just had to write in the same way that people like have to go outside or have to drink water. And it was kind of cool to meet like a real person who claims to have the same compulsion. Like Phil would just be like, I just have to write or else I'll just be kind of bad and intolerable. Like, I think that was kind of cool and inspiring. Um, so I don't know if have met anyone like that previously, but
Yeah, not really. I was definitely like, I mean, and maybe this should not be the judgment, but he was talking about being like, if I like don't write enough, I'll just get like really irritable and everyone will hate me. And I'm like, I wish. But
you mean for yourself?
Yeah. But like,
well, but it could also be cooked because maybe your like amount of writing wouldn't actually go up, and then you'd just be irritable and people would hate you.
Yeah. I mean, objectively, it's probably not a good thing, right? You're just like selecting a certain set of scenarios in which your mood gets worse and stuff. But it would be cool to have more of like a intrinsic drive towards like needing to feeling a need to write and stuff. Yeah, otherwise, yeah, we recorded this episode like right after the story came out, which was over a month ago now. So quite a bit. We've already got the next one just published. So a bit unfortunate on our part. But yeah, okay, calling it unfortunate is sort of unfair.
Leave that in.
What's up?
Are you gonna leave that in?
I don't know. Probably not.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like talking about
we talked a fair amount about screenwriting type stuff, like adapting stories, which is pretty cool, interesting. And then I really like talking about writing in kids, because I thought Dylan's story did particularly well at that. And I do feel like there's just like really a noticeable dichotomy between stories where like the children just like feel believable and real, versus ones where they're just like, oh, this is just like some adult's fantasy of a kid that doesn't remember what it was like. But yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think that people will kind of just uniformly make children worse slash more immature in a way that doesn't make a ton of sense. Um, I also think it's true that to an even greater extent than adults, kids will just kind of rise up into the role that they are placed in.
Uh-huh.
Like I think children doing sort of extraordinary acts is not really as surprising as media may lead you to believe.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like some amount of just like, I don't know, just even being able to like be independent and responsible is just like so dependent on like how much you give kids that ability. Like, I don't know, like, you know, a 6-year-old is definitely like capable of going to and from school like by themselves. And there's purposefully good reasons why like most 6-year-olds are like not doing this, right? It's like quite young. But for safety reasons and stuff, it's totally fair. But at the same time, it's like, kids even at that age are like definitely capable of being independent enough to like do their own thing to some extent.
I think that when I was a kid, um, there were often times when I would see adults place children on this platform, or there are often times as a kid when I would see adults place children on this pedestal as a result of being able to exert agency in certain ways, especially in the context of making some discovery or being on some TV show. There was this one show in particular where kids would compete in baking contests, and I remember my parents were just so like almost in disbelief that the kids could even do these things. But me as a kid, I was like, okay, this is really not that crazy. Like, obviously, I'm not doing these things because I'm not good at baking and don't like it at all. But if I was sufficiently motivated and given these resources, like, surely I could do this. But this is only like a very tight window in which I was able to have this awareness. And even now, like I'm significantly less confident that I would be able to have done these things as a child. So, but I think there's this weird moment where when you are kind of like an older kid, you realize that, kids flexing when they're at a young age is really not all that.
All right, so you recently wrote this article, not for Synthesized Sunset, but for Republic of Letters, which is pretty exciting, on Quizbowl, your experience in Quizbowl, and sort of its merit as an activity. Yeah, want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So this is an article that I wrote quite a long time ago, at least the first draft, because yeah, I mean, I was just approached by Republic of Letters to write some article. I actually didn't think it would get published, but then about a week ago, they were just like, "Oh, we're thinking about publishing your article," and then I was like, "Okay, wait, this article is not really as good as I want to be. I'm gonna make some edits." And so it ended up in the form that you have today. Uh, I think it's pretty fitting that my first article published somewhere is about Quizbowl because Quizbowl is definitely the thing that I've directed the most mental energy towards since being in high school. And I have a lot of different takes on it. I mean, I could probably write like 100 different articles about Quizbowl, but the particular so just as some context, Quizbowl is this like fast-paced trivia adjacent activity where it's very focused on the fairness of evaluating knowledge. So in the same way that the SAT is supposed to be this like standardized tests that doesn't have too much variance, Quizbowl is sort of meant to be standardized trivia. And it ends up developing a pretty unique subculture as a result because it's a little bit more like I think trivia, the connotation is just so like unserious and casual and pop culture-y. And so when you add that standardized element, it just totally ends up in this unique thing, like a true blend of like academia and trivia culture. I think maybe it's not so different from Jeopardy in terms of the vibe, but also I feel like not that many people are interfacing with the Jeopardy community directly. Um, but anyway, the thing that I want to focus on is the fact that trivia is often seen, or Quiz Bowl and trivia more broadly is often seen as kind of a waste of time. There is this naive critique of like, oh, you're just memorizing facts. But then there's the more sophisticated critique of, oh, well, you're just memorizing facts. I guess what I mean by that is, I guess what I mean by that is there is a level on which you think that trivia and Quiz Bowl isn't really testing anything real. Like there are some people that don't think you can really get better at trivia in a systematic way and don't see much merit in this. I think this is kind of a silly critique because you're definitely learning real information and there's ways in which you can get better and it definitely does make you become more knowledgeable. But also, I think there are people that know this, especially people who have played a lot of Quiz Bowl, but still criticize it because of the way that it causes you to interface with the world. For example, you may watch some movie, but then the entire time you're just thinking like, oh, how can this shit come up in Quiz Bowl? I wonder how many times it's been asked up in Quiz Bowl. And then like after you watch the movie, you just like look it up in Quiz Bowl and make flashcards for all the facts that were in this movie that you have to remember the next time you play a Quiz Bowl question on this particular topic. And I think stuff like this is a bit bad. Like, I don't think you want your experience with art to be totally tainted by the fact that it could come up in Quiz Bowl. But the case that I want to make is that it's actually kind of good that you are figuring out ways to use your knowledge in the process of playing Quiz Bowl. And I think that the main impulse that motivates how people engage with knowledge differently in Quiz Bowl is this impulse to turn the knowledge in their head from something that's totally abstract into something concrete and usable. And that is kind of cool. Like, it is kind of cool that you're spending this time turning this stuff in your head into stuff that kind of like exists in the real world. And I try to make the case that the main value of Quiz Bowl is that it makes this knowledge that doesn't feel particularly real when you acquire it for the first time into something that's real and really, really exists and really can be useful and is really something people talk about. And so I hope that I was able to convey that value to the audience.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's I feel like that point doesn't like I guess I'm surprised. I feel like that feels like a very novel take, but I'm kind of surprised by that. It feels like a take people would have. Like you have to have some outlet to use your knowledge. But I haven't really heard someone say it in those words at least before. But definitely feels true to me.
Yeah, I think what I tried to make novel about it is that there is kind of like this transformation process that occurs. I think this is also the case with writing, right? Like when you write something, you're like converting your raw thought material into something that's like concrete, like on a page, right? And you can kind of pull from many different sources and even experiences and just distill it all down to the stuff that's real. And I think that the same thing is happening in Quiz Bowl. Like, I think most people who, when they start at Quiz Bowl, they just have all this information in their brain that's kind of soup, and they've like never really talked about it with anyone. But then in the process of playing Quiz Bowl, it kind of transforms that data in your mind into something that you can like readily index and access. And so I think there is a way by which playing Quiz Bowl and engaging with Quiz Bowl does kind of like rewire your brain in a way that, yeah, in some ways may cheapen some aspects of engaging with art and culture, but also makes you into the sort of person that just like uses this information in their daily life and thinks of it as something that you can use. And I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think there's also something that comes from like during the act of playing Quiz Bowl itself. It's very like say there's some toss up on like I don't know, some like it's pretty clear from the start it's some ancient like civilization somewhere, but you don't really know where in the first few lines. And like as a result, like as that part is going, you're like thinking through like all the different ancient civilizations and like comparing them and thinking about like the various differences between them and stuff. Like there's something about like the uncertainty before you know like what the answer is that I think gets you to do like a pretty good like synthesis of just like all the stuff you know about in this like type of topic and
Yeah.
whatnot. That yeah, I feel like even as someone who is like not particularly good at Quizbowl and didn't have that many questions in which there was like or like early on I knew what was going on too much. I felt like there were a lot of times where I was just like putting things together kind of. I was like, "Oh, it's like that," sort of. Which was pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, it puts you in a very interesting headspace, a Quizbowl question. I mean, this is very abstract for our listeners, probably, because not heard a Quizbowl question. Maybe we should read
We
a
could
Quizbowl
read one.
question.
Why don't we read one?
Or you want to read me some toss-up?
Yeah. What category do you want?
I guess literature.
Is
presumably.
QuizDB still existing?
Not really. There's a much better
Gosh.
one. It's like QB Reader.
Oh, it came out?
Yeah,
Wait, was that the one that was like long awaited for a million years?
I think so. Yeah. It's like it uses Python to scrape the archive, so it actually is like every toss-up.
All
Which is
right.
pretty cool.
We'll go high school nat difficulty.
All right.
Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's fine.
And what lit?
Yeah, there's like a high
Yeah.
chance that I'll already have read this question, but that's okay.
I mean, that's fine. Our listeners will be impressed then. All right. This work ends with one character standing and stretching after taking an electric train ride into the countryside with her family. Characters in this work include a cleaning woman who constantly bangs doors and a trio of lodgers who attempt to leave without paying rent. In the original,
Okay, this is like the metamorphosis.
yay, indeed.
Yeah.
And just to give context, like this, the last section here of this toss-up is it opens with a traveling salesman waking from a night of uneasy dreams for 10 points named this Franz Kafka work in which Gregor Samsa transforms into an insect. So, yeah.
But yeah, anyway, all this is to say that I think Quizbowl puts you in this really interesting headspace where you're kind of in some like information landscape and you kind of gotta like look around and like it's sort of like shrinking. Like I imagine it's like your brain is kind of on this plot of land that has like the features and it's kind of just like shrinking and shrinking. And sometimes it shrinks to the point where you're not even standing on it anymore and you're just like, oh fuck, I gotta like think about something else. Like you could be in this information space and you're thinking it's like about literature, but it's actually about like history or something. I mean, that's a bad example, but like it could be talking about like you could think it's about science, but it's actually about like philosophy. You're just like, oh fuck, I actually gotta like move my thoughts over here. And I think this is a really interesting experience, like being on this shrinking plane. It adds a lot of tension. And also, I think it's more fun because I think most people who, when they play trivia, I think most people who play trivia, when the question is read, it's just kind of like, you know it or you don't know it. You know it or you don't know it. Sometimes there's some like lateral thinking involved, like maybe you have to put some pieces of information together. But in general, a straight up factual question, there's not really much of a process. Um, and I think that people, when they're starting out, they kind of do play Quizbowl in that way. Like they're kind of just like sitting around being like, ugh. But then when the answer or when something they do know comes up, they just like perk up and like, oh shit. And they just like start listening. And then a couple seconds later, they'll like ring in. And many people just never stop playing Quizbowl like that. But if you really kind of lock in and you're like in that information space, what this will allow you to do is it will like allow you to increase your reaction time because in your mind you will kind of like be in a location that's closer to the information that you're about to retrieve as opposed to just kind of like not being ready to retrieve any information at all and kind of just being like la la la. Like there is a way in which you can like put yourself closer to the information that's stored in your brain, in your head, like in the moment before it happens. I feel like that's kind of cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I ever really got there. Yeah, just for the for the listeners here, since we haven't really talked about, I mean, we've brought up Quizbowl from time to time. Considering like I feel like how major it is in your life, we haven't talked about it much. So, can we get like a day in the life of Kevin as a sophomore in high school on the Quizbowl grind? Just kind of how did that look?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depended on the day, but I definitely saw this as my main thing. I mean, it was very addictive. I think it's probably more instructive to learn what I did in senior year. Like
Hmm.
when
Yeah,
I
I
was a
mean,
senior, I like when I would go to school, I would either be reading some story somewhat dangerously on my phone as I walked to school, or I would be listening to the classic Mike Duncan History of Rome podcast. And then I would get to school and do some class, but also probably do a little bit of this Quizbowl multiplayer client and talk to some of my friends who were just like around. It was really fun to play Quizbowl online with friends. I mean, this is on a website called protobowl.com, which still exists, although it's definitely not as vibrant as it used to be because they now disable the chat by default. And I think this is like a pretty fair decision, but still, I can't say that I don't miss that atmosphere. But I would also just during my break spend a lot of time reading like a ton of questions. There were a lot of cases in which I would just be sampling from like maybe even some like alphabetical list or just like some list on some very specific topic, and then trying to like look up information in about those things like on Wikipedia and stuff. And a lot of the time, I would compile them into like this more readable tutorial. So I generated this big document for like Chinese dynasties, like learning about Chinese dynasties. I also have this like sort of big corpus of like world literature authors. And this was all pretty fun. I think that most of the information that I gained, again, was not particularly, it was a little bit trivial, I guess you could say. Like, for example, me knowing that there are like these three borders in the Metamorphosis. This was information that I attained much before actually reading the Metamorphosis. And in fact, having read the Metamorphosis, I don't exactly remember like when that happened.
yeah, that I don't either.
I know that it does happen, but it's not super vivid in my memory. But at the same time, like it definitely laid the foundation for me to delve deeper into these topics. And I think that in the same way that learning a language when you're quite young, even if you don't learn it all the way, it gives you like a scaffold for learning that language later. I think that learning all of these like random bits of information about literature has made the process of engaging with literature a lot less daunting because I'm just like, wow, there people only really talk about this like small subset of people that I had to learn about for a quiz bowl, so it's not really that bad, and like I can generally understand the vibe of what people are saying, even when I haven't read the books directly. And there was some real knowledge too. Like I definitely learned a lot about the Roman Empire and learned a lot about short stories as a result of these things. But I think that this distinction between real knowledge and fake knowledge is important, but perhaps not as salient as people in Quiz Bowl assume it to be.
Yeah, and I mean, there's obviously gonna be like I feel like it's hard to have completely fake knowledge. Like like you're gonna get some real knowledge eventually, no.
Yeah. I mean, there's some stuff that like I don't know. I mean, there's some stuff where if you're just like word associating, like obviously pure word association is not knowledge, but like even if you are word associating like a novel or something, like I feel like if you just go one step further, like if you just know that like three borders equals the metamorphosis, this is not real knowledge. But like even if you were to go one step further and be like, well, I know that there is a scene in the metamorphosis where there are like three borders that show up who don't pay. This is definitely real knowledge, I guess. Like this is
Mhm.
like actual information that exists in the world that you know. And I think that there's a there's an extent to which people like over apply the like word association thing to invalidate forms of knowledge that are like certainly real.
Yeah, yeah.
I will say that Quizbowl and its value kind of varies by the category. Like, I would say Quizbowl is really good for history. I would say
Mhm.
that most people who engage with history through Quizbowl end up developing a pretty real interest in history. And this includes myself. I actually was like not particularly interested in history when I started playing Quizbowl. And now I would say it's not like my main interest, but it's definitely like I would definitely consider myself to be a history interested person. But I think for other categories like math, especially, it's definitely not as good. Like the format just doesn't translate quite as well. And to explain exactly why that is a little bit complex, but the question format basically lends itself better to some kinds of knowledge than others, basically. But
Yeah, I also think math like inherently has a bit of the just like you're naturally going to be applying your knowledge more um than like other subjects. Uh
right,
because
like
yeah, you're kind of
right,
like
like
learning the application more than you're like learning facts, you know? Like
right,
like like nowhere in a math class are you just going to like learn what a derivative is and then just like never have to take a derivative. Like these
yeah,
always are going hand in hand. But in
yeah,
other subjects it's not really the case.
yeah. I mean, I think that there's probably the case to be made that math knowledge sticks the longest, right? Like,
Yeah. Um
certainly, right? I mean, people probably learn how to do algebra much longer than they, or remember how to do algebra much longer than they remember, like, very basic parts of the history curriculum.
yeah, probably yeah, definitely true. Although admittedly math also just you spend so many more hours learning how to do algebra than like any, specific history uh portion. Cuz you know, there's just like you'll take algebra, you'll take geometry, which has a bunch of algebra. You'll take algebra again. You'll take calculus, which has a bunch of algebra. You'll take like chemistry or physics, which has a bunch of algebra. It's really like you are gonna get beaten into you more so. Um, and I mean, I do definitely feel like even with math, it's like if you don't have any way to apply it, you'll kind of like forget all about it. Like I think most people who maybe took like calculus senior year of high school but then didn't go into STEM at all kind of just completely lose it. Uh, but yeah.
Maybe, but yeah, I think it is interesting that like I guess kind of what I'm trying to get at is that Quiz Bowl, similar to practicing math or writing or practicing a language in real life, is actually an experience that kind of burns these things like into your mind. Like the information is encoded in the experience, or the knowledge is like it's like the knowledge is like inside of the experience that you had, which kind of
Mm-hmm.
runs deeper than just like the facts that you remember. Like just the experience of retrieving this information like over and over and over and over. It makes it more permanent and more of a thing that you can access. And this is pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like for example, in high school, like through high school I played the trombone, right? So and then I just like kind of stopped that after high school and haven't really since outside of like one or two times a few years ago where I was just like did it randomly for fun. And then I also took French. Um and these are both and after high school never took French again. And these are both like in some sense like tremendous wastes of time in that like I spent an insane amount of I mean especially trombone, but French too. A ton of hours throughout my life learning these things to like never really use them. But they do feel like different categories of things. Like the French feels like more useless because I can't go and like speak French because like the knowledge was like so academic, right? Like the main things I remember are just like, I know how to conjugate etra. It's like who gives a fuck? But like I could pick up a trombone and like play trombone at like a, moderately decent level. Like I don't do this, but it's like it's something kind of like innate that I have because like all the knowledge I gained was from like doing the activity rather than just like learning about how to do the activity and then never applying it, it does feel like a different sort of category of thing.
Yeah, and on the other hand, like if you were sitting, or if you spent your final year of French instruction just like in French, it would probably be the opposite thing. Like you'd probably be these at least something.
Yeah, exactly. Like if I don't know, if I like cap this off by like studying abroad or something, then I think I would feel pretty similarly about like both French and trombone. But yeah, this didn't happen.
I was actually recently talking with Gordon about this, but I was wondering if I should like get to like the lowest level of proficiency for both Spanish and Japanese just so I can like turn the amount of time I spent learning this activity into something that was like really real, like something that like really actually happened and is like in my brain for use, sort of, because like it does sort of feel like you're turning wasted hours into non-wasted hours, if that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's a pretty good place to wrap things up. Kevin, do you have any short fiction recommendations for us?
Yeah, so I've been on this big Chinese sci-fi kick. Like I've been reading a lot of Cixin Liu in preparation for the next article, and I also read the collection Invisible Planets by Ken Liu. And I would particularly like to recommend the story called Call Girl by Kong Fei. I don't know what to say about it other than it's just like really interesting. You can actually find it on Apex magazine, I believe. But yeah, and it's a pretty interesting story. Not really like anything else that I've read before.
Awesome. Well, thanks for listening, and we'll see you all at some point in the future.
All right. See ya.